So I'll just say that I think one of the interesting things that I picked up on, and hopefully you picked up on, is that while like noise stuff can be sort of interesting, there was something about some of the more controlled pattern kind of stuff that also had a distinct power. You know, and I would also ask you to consider, like, how could you actually combine those two things? Might be an interesting space to operate in as well. I'm gonna, in addition, just go ahead and start passing this around. This is a sample of a piece of aluminum that I CNC'd on our machine at home. I've created a cloud texture, again using depth map and Blender, put it into the CNC machine. It's carved this cloud texture. The things I want you to note with this is, A, there's a mistake in the middle of it, where my bit lacked enough lubrication for one very, very, very small moment and ruined the piece. A $300 block of aluminum, right? Because it's actually from a block of aluminum like this. So note the mistake. Also note the routing lines. You can actually see the tool marks on this. You need to start thinking about like how these tool marks are actually going to shape and affect your final design, because you can't not have these. You can decide which direction they go, and maybe they can even be diagonal, but there will be tooling marks. Because we're not going to have time to like sand and polish these. But, you know, not to disregard that. But I think what's really interesting is the tooling marks on this piece in particular actually added a lot to the feel and sensibility. So you should actually run your hands across this in two directions, and you'll feel how smooth it is in one direction and how you know, like jagged it is in the other direction. It also affects the way that it picks up light, to the point where when we actually showed this at a gallery, we were shining halogen lights at it, and it actually sparked rainbows. So you can see rainbow textures come out of the aluminum. We're not going to do aluminum. not all of this applies, but like you should understand the way that like even these small decisions affect the feel of something. They affect the look of the visuality of something, and not just like, oh, is it a perfect surface or is it not a perfect surface? Is it polished? Is it not polished? All of these things are subtle parts of the final result of your piece. Okay? Yeah?
So is aluminum something we can do on engineering?
I don't know. I don't think so, because I don't think it's set up with the lubricant, to be honest. You're probably only going to be doing... They've got metal machines in the other side, and I think a couple of them are set up CNC style, but that's a whole different beast.
Yeah.
It's like an old school mill with the CNC motors added on.
Yeah. That sounds really cool.
Yeah. Because to mill stuff like this, you need an actual like spindle that can do low speed, high torque, and you can't just have a wood router tacked onto the end of it. So I'm not saying we don't have the capability. I'm just saying like it's going to be out of the bandwidth of the.
I'm just like
yeah.
curious.
No, it's good. So I'll just pass this around. Do be careful. It's got some sharp edges. For those that are like especially interested, the reason this has sharp edges is this is actually made from a 12-inch by 12-inch piece that was all the sort of cloud texture out of aluminum. Because of this mistake in the middle of it, we actually took it to a water jet cutter and they cut it into 9 pieces.
Cut out the middle section.
No, they cut it into 9 pieces, and so we've just been like giving away the small chunks as gifts, and then this is like the remainder, like shit one that you know, like you don't give away. It's I don't know, but that's why the edges are so sharp. That's the finish from a water jet cutter. So you know the water jet cutter will do 2-inch aluminum like butter, which is quite nice.
Or you can't do like depth change with the water jet, right?
That is correct. It's just cut through. Yeah. Or at least not in a controllable way. I mean, I guess in theory you could try and,
Right.
yeah. You can't use it to carve. You might be able to get like a very specific depth groove, kind of. But, yeah. All right, cool. So, what I want to do is, I guess I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about the project. To be honest, I haven't developed the language for the project because I'm seeing this project as a much more sort of textural, pseudo-architectural space as opposed to an art piece. So I think this is going to be much more of a design piece. So conceptually, I'm not going to be pressing you nearly as much, or really at all, as much as I'm going to be asking you to really think about the design, the flow, the texture, all of these things. So it's, and some of this comes from like looking out at like CNC art as a thing, and it's not much of a thing, for better or worse. And so I'm pretty intrigued to actually let you all a little bit more loose and to think and actually harken back to some of the original spots that this class started. Think about the nature of pattern, think about repetition, because here's the big picture plan, all right? Again, I'm gonna write something up, but I want you all to be thinking this weekend, and so I'm trying to give you a picture. And some of the reason I don't have this totally formulated is because I'm going to the training session tomorrow, and I'm going to have a much better handle on like what is and isn't doable and reasonable, right? And so I didn't want to like give you a project and then be like, oh wait, I can't actually ask you to do that. So the goal is the following. I've already bought some black walnut, cutting that up tonight. You will each get a block of black walnut, approximately 6 inches by 6 inches, by 2 inches, 6 by 6 by 2. It's amazingly gorgeous wood. You're gonna love this thing forever, at least I hope you do. Each chunk of wood is like $10. But I love black walnut. It smells like chocolate when you mill it. It's gonna be amazing. Yeah.
How big is it?
I think it's about 2 inches, but I need to go do a final measurement.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you final measurements, but it's approximately 6 by 6 by 2.
Okay.
Cool? Yeah, it's a nice chunk of wood. So this is the initial goal, is you've got this block. We really don't have room for mistakes, so you will have to be careful. You're going to have this block, and you're going to mill a texture, a surface into this, a dimensional surface, right? It needs to have some sensibility of 3 dimensions. That is a requirement, because, and I put that clearly because you could just like make a wood block print where it's like, okay, all this stays flat and I just like remove all the material in the middle. Like it needs to have more dimensionality than just like this stuff is up and this stuff is down, right? I would consider that like semi-dimensional. So it's got to have some dimensionality. Once we are done creating this block, and milling that is going to take some time. You're going to have to do 2 passes. You're going to have to do what's known as a rough pass, and then we'll do like a fine pass. I'll talk about some of that process as we get closer. But once you have that pass, we are then going to pull copies of that. That wood block is going to become a positive, and you're going to pull copies with the vacuum form machine. And you're going to pull 4 copies with the vacuum form machine. And there's a very specific reason to pull 4 copies of a square, is because the goal is then you can arrange these 4 blocks in a 2 by 2 situation so that these 4 repetitions have a conversation. So really, I think some of the core challenges to this is how do you make a texture so that when you put these 4 things together, it becomes more than the original. And that's probably going to involve turning these in different directions, right? So like if you turn this one 90, this one 180, and this one 270, but that's not necessarily necessary. Just for example, if you were to do that, how would that set up a new kind of pattern that's more than the original? What I don't want to see is a perfect seamless tile, right? You shouldn't make something that when you put 4 of these together, it just makes the same pattern over and over again, repeating, all right? So there should be some way in which when the 4 of these come together, it makes something more than the pattern on any one of them. The pattern or the form on any one of them. Yeah?
So, material questions, I guess. What are we pulling these in for vacuum forming? Just like clear plastic or...
Yeah, I'm gonna go and like grab some choices, but it'll probably be clear or white, or I'm gonna see if there's like a nice gray. In what way?
I'm just thinking about paint again.
Thinking about paint? Maybe. Let's.
Private conversation?
No, not private conversation. I originally did think a lot about how to paint these, like especially if you did clear and then like painted on the inside.
Painting inside, like.
I think there could be some interesting results. So I'm not totally against that, but I want to, again, tomorrow I'll understand more of like process and possibilities, and I can follow up.
Okay.
I mean, you know, like the purist architect in me is like, oh no, everything will be black or white, or possibly gray, and that'll be exciting. But at the same time, like, I understand the notion to like bring color into this, and so I'm not writing it off yet. I guess that's the answer.
Okay.
Cool?
Yeah.
So this is the big picture of where we're going. All right? This is a design challenge that I'm putting in front of you. I think it's an interesting design challenge. I'm hoping you're also intrigued by this. And I'll continue to sort of like formulate the writing around it. But this is what I want you thinking about this weekend. To get us started, I'm going to show you a few artists, and just we can talk about some of their work and how they're using CNC in their process. And hopefully that can give you just a little bit more movement forward. So, again, I have put these up. For today. So here's the GitHub page with the Blender instructions that we're going to get to next. But let's just look at some of these artists and some of these projects. This is the artwork of Daniel Widrick. He has been doing quite a number of projects, these sort of generative chairs and tables, and I think this is a phone case, but also doing these very sort of intense architectural practices, as well as working, you know, to make this kind of work. But, you know, some of these pieces are actually just complex CNC milling. So this is a very large piece. You see that here he's taken advantage of the lines and actually didn't do a final, you know, by seeing that these lines have a sort of rounded divot, I know that he's used what's known as a ball nose tip, right? And the ball nose tip is going to leave that sort of rounded circle, and then he's used the sort of like direction of those lines to enhance his idea to the point where he's actually done the algorithm so that you can actually see the CNC machine has done an outward spiral as its process of working, instead of the typical method of like back and forth across or up and down or diagonal. He's actually reprogrammed it to do this sort of gorgeous spiral to enhance that sort of overall surface. This is just done in foam, so he's able to do these pretty quickly, and you can get away with a lot more because you don't actually have like hard material in your way. But I think it's hopefully an inspirational image of how you could use some of these. What I like about it is like how much you can get in a sensibility of like folds and contours, even though knowing that you still only have a straight up and down milling bit, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that you can sort of push with it. But I also like that he used this unfinished look on purpose. So I sort of put both of those things in front of you. And you should check out some of his other work. This is someone that really is sitting on that space in between an artist, an architect, and a designer. And that's okay, right? Like, you don't have to pick one or the other if you're comfortable in multiple spaces. I think I did see his more projects here. Also some really nice 3D printed stuff.
Is that big one at the top, space filler? It says ABS plastic.
Where?
Oh, on his homepage, the top right one.
Go back one?
I don't know. I'm just at the top of his homepage and it's space filler. It's like a black kind of amorphous object.
It's on the main page.
But he's on the main page. I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't know if he
Let's try this.
Is it just randomly loading?
I haven't examined
It
Yeah,
says
it's on mine.
it says ABS plastic.
Yeah,
That
top right.
This one?
Top.
This?
No, top right.
This one?
Yeah.
You're the right.
Huh. I think it's probably, yeah, okay. So there's a kind of expanded plastic that you can get that's got solids. So it's the plastic equivalent of poster board.
Okay.
So but instead of foam in between, it has foamed plastic. And then the top and bottom surface are clean. And routers actually love it. I'll show you Lolly's project that we did with this material.
Okay.
Yeah, so they basically just milled all of the shapes
Right.
and then glued them together.
Okay.
Because you can use the ABS glue or,
Right.
like, it's pretty friendly in that way. And it's super light.
So this
Because
thing is
it's-
actually, I was just going to say, so this thing's like quite deceptively light.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, it's
It looks
not
awesome.
ABS 3D printed.
Right.
It's a good question. Thanks. Yeah, so I encourage you to continue to check out these people's work. I'm not going to go too deep into it. He's got some other CNC milling stuff. But again, CNC is involved in a lot of the pieces, just in other kinds of ways. This is probably done with a laser cutter, but you could also do something similar with a CNC. This is another CNC foam piece, which is quite nice. Yeah. We're going pretty far back in time now. Some earlier work. I'll stop. Anyway, check him out. We also, this is a Korean woman, Chung Jong-rai, who's also been working in the space. Technically, I think she does a lot of this, but not a lot of it. Like, these are probably CNC, but she's then put them all on edge. So she's basically like cutting out flat pieces of thin plywood with the CNC machine. So she's not doing up and down. She's just doing like a 2D, and and then she's like gluing them all together to get a surface like this. That's what that looks like to me. These actually look like they're much more of a subtractive process or an additive process. Some of these suggest that she might CNC some of these, and then some of the taller ones she actually then sort of assembles by hand by gluing on additional layers. Because remember, I told you before, like CNCing stuff that's a couple inches deep is easy. You can't, but like CNCing stuff that like comes out of the wall at like 12 inches, you just can't get the machine in there, right? Because the machine is this thing, even though your drill bit is only this long. And I've seen like 6-inch bits that can do some deeper stuff, but you can only use them on foam because the deflection problem is pretty profound. So all I'm pointing out is like she might have CNC'd a lot of this and then like added some additional stuff by hand. Cool. Now, of course, all those rules go away a little bit if you have a 5-axis CNC machine, but that's a different discussion. All right. I'll also show you this project by digital artist Ralph Becker. He basically built a milling machine that just uses data. So it actually creates, it's just got a block of foam, and then it's getting a stream of live search requests from German search engines, and it's using those search requests to actually like erode the block of foam. So basically, if somebody makes a similar search request, he then actually routes that out a second time or a third time or 100 times. And so the ravines actually start to like be streams of searches that are more popular, as opposed to sort of more rare searches which might do smaller indentations on this sort of field. And I like this idea of taking something like this data, having a data visualization, but that creates over time, it sort of erodes over time according to the popularity of things. So there's a nice set of correlations there. You can see here, again, they're using a really long bit, and that's just because it's foam. Like you couldn't use a bit like that for wood. So,
How long was it there?
I don't know, actually. It's a good question. I mean, he's obviously run it for several years, but I suspect that he puts a new block of foam on for every show. That's what I would do. So you would get kind of a unique sculpture for every length of every show.
Right.
So the last thing that I'll show you is actually a couple projects from Lale and I. There's a reason I'm interested in CNC milling and art. It's because we've been doing some of it. Let's see here. I'll take you to Lale's website. And I'll point you to a couple of projects. The first one is this transitional fragments piece, which was originally commissioned for when they opened the Anderson Academic Commons. When they first reopened the library after all of its renovations, they asked us to make some new pieces. And so we created a few different pieces with a few different styles. And those started with, on the top floor, we created these cloud terrains. And I think we've got we took the photo off. in situ. We basically made a series of these 4 cloud terrains. And through the clouds, you would see these small cities, and they look something like this. And so the clouds are generative, the cities are generative, all made in Blender, and then it's all CNC'd out of HDPE, which is cutting board material. The nice part is it's highly recyclable, and even the shavings from the CNC machine you can give back to the recycle place. And the idea was to have this sort of like explore the notion of cloud cover as both a thing about mood, but like in an age of satellite surveillance, that perhaps cloud cover starts to become an inversion of the power structure, where all the richest people are above the clouds and can be seen by the satellites at all times, but then people who are below the clouds actually have the ability to get away with more things because the visibility has been reduced. We wanted to have some of this sort of interesting surveillance conversation with the piece. Just for your reference, these pieces are about 30 inches by 30 inches on the CNC. They take approximately 22 hours to mill, and then they take another 20 hours to hand carve the cities, because the CNC milling process actually makes gorgeous sort of clouds. This is like not polished or anything, like it's just like high detail milling. But the cities they all come out rounded as well. And this is like one of those like mind-blowing things, right? It's like you do all this CNCing and you expect that it does angular stuff really well and not rounded stuff. But it turns out, especially once you start using these finished bits which have a rounded tip, everything gets rounded. And so then I used Japanese hand tools to basically hand carve all the cities to make them angular. So that took another 20 hours for each of the pieces. An interesting side note, because we're talking a little bit about materiality, by removing, so we start with like basically 2-inch thick pieces of HDPE, and you essentially mill the whole surface, and the very last thing you do is cut the surface out of the sort of block of HDPE. And during that process, what happens is, because the material has built-in stresses, because of the way they make it by running it through rollers, when they run it through rollers, it actually changes the molecular structure, which makes a flat product. But the second you start removing all of the top end of the product and do nothing to the back, the whole thing wants to curl up. So these pieces all have a curvature, which is really intense. And so we had several massive failures where that very last moment it would be cutting them out and the whole thing would just go pop, because all the stress had suddenly been released. So yeah, I've got 2 or 3 of these in the garage that just are ruined.
That's a product from the manufacturer of this material?
Yeah.
Why would they make it that way?
They can't not make it that way.
Oh, that's just how, okay. It sounds like they had an extra step with the rollers.
Oh no, that's just like, that's part of the process. Oh. And this happens with a lot of these sort of, these kind of plastic materials, that they have internal stressors that they're assuming you're just gonna like cut a block of it out. They don't expect you to carve it, right?
So what did you do to prevent that?
You can't.
Oh, you just got lucky.
Oh, I just would have to be there at that moment, and I would basically like use my hands and some gloves and some crowbars to basically prevent it from exploding at the last moment.
Is there a reason, would it not do the same thing if you just cut out the block first? Why don't you just have the material that you're actually presenting and then do the surface of that?
Because then you don't have anything to hold your block while you're cutting it.
Because it moves with rollers.
No, because the CNC machine's running all over this thing, it would move it around. So you have to fix it to the table. And so either you like screw it from below and then hope your tip never hits any of the screws, or you leave it in a frame, carve all the stuff away, and then the last thing you do is cut it out. It's a good question. These are
Make it like a temporary frame for that size.
right. Yeah. That's another tactic is, and we'll talk about some of those because again, like I don't know what engineering uses, so I'm gonna have to go over and find out what they're going to use for their sort of waste board and all of these pieces. But yeah, these are important questions. Thank you.
In the same series, what is the black material?
It's also HDPE. It comes in natural and black. This is the only two colors you can get it in, at least at the 2-inch thickness. So yeah, moving through this to the next floor. So here on the blue wall on the middle floor of the library, we had these pieces, which are about 40 inches wide and almost 30 inches tall. One of the tactics that we tried with this series after the curvature of these is we added basically a 1/2-inch frame all the way around, hoping that these would act as like kind of like I-beams, right? To sort of prevent some of that bending. So we added a frame within the frame. It worked a little bit. Like these are less curved than the other ones. But I think with these, I don't want to go too far conceptually, but we were looking at landscapes, we were looking at vectors, and I'll point out that we actually, again, this is a case where we left the tooling marks. Instead of making this smooth terrain as we have with the clouds, we actually just did a rough pass with a flat tip bit and left it that way. So we got this very sort of like awesome architectural contour map. Topo. And so it has a very different kind of look. And then it's covered in these sort of like arrows, which we imagine are vectors for, immigration or language or viruses or wars. Like we liked how it could be anything from the path of a butterfly to the way that one set of people took over another set of people. So it's interesting to us. The final set was on the bottom floor. We made an entire set of these landscapes, and the shape of all of these are actually the shapes of these sort of like 10 largest underground reserves for oil, natural gas, and water. So these became the sort of continents of resources. We were really interested in how perhaps these continents actually have more to say about our relationship to other humans than the continents above the ground. Like wars are fought over these continents, right? Much more than what's on the surface. And so we wanted to sort of unearth that a little bit. Again, in this case, we were using generative textures. So this was the generative texture that we came up with for natural gas. And we have a texture for oil. And again, these were all just textures we built within Blender, actually, using some of the noise algorithms. And then there's another one for water, which is like caked mud. So I just thought I would show you these as a sort of example of where all you can take some of this. The last thing that I'll show you here, I guess I'll point out, this is the full aluminum piece that we did before we cut it into pieces. And you'll see here the really beautiful close-up of how the lines and the rainbows sort of came out from the existence of those lines. So it's quite nice. The last thing that I'll show you is Lale's Magmon project, which was up at the Denver Art Museum. Let me go through all this actually. Basically, the Denver Art Museum commissioned her to do a show. We built this 12 by 12 by 12 room that you could go into. This giant black cube. The entire outside of the cube is covered in these topos. And so this was all done with a CNC machine, just because it's way faster than running through a laser. Something about doing like etching with a laser, what it does is it sort of like slides back and forth and almost does a very sort of digital vaporization, whereas with the router, you can actually have the router produce the paths much more like a plotter. And so we basically skinned the entire surface of the project with this sort of topo taken from the Middle East.
What's that made out of?
Do what?
What's the material?
That's just acrylic, just black acrylic. It looked like a nice obsidian once you lit it well and everything. And then the inside was much more complex. This is all CNC'd as well. We used a particular arabesque pattern, and then we used processing to actually put that vector file into processing and then have it degrade as it goes up. So we actually ran processing to sort of add randomness and chaos to the form, and then we would re-export that as an SVG and then carve it. So this is with that extruded foam material. The extruded ABS. And so in this case, we've actually carved this, we cut it with what's known as a V-tip. And so it's just like a 45-degree cone that you use for cutting. And so then everything you cut with it has this bevel, this sort of V bevel. And so this is all sort of like one path. It would cut out this shape and then cut out this and cut out this, and so on and so forth. In the case of a material like this, just to come back to your question, Tristan, we actually use spray adhesive to make that entire thing stick. Because one of the other really dangerous things to happen is if you cut out this small shape and it suddenly catches the bit and comes flying, that'll actually like go into you. So it becomes a very dangerous situation, especially for something like this where you're cutting lots and lots of holes. So you actually like spray adhesive the whole thing, stick it to the table really securely and cut it so that these pieces stay. And then at the end you actually lift up the part you want to keep, and then you scrape off all the holes. It wasn't awesome, but we used like 16 cans of spray.
So how big were those things that you were cutting out?
So the table that I built for our house just does, it's a 4x4.
Okay.
So
these are all 4x4 sections?
yeah.
So I guess this is more like a museum question. Like, how does the commission like this work? Like, so when you contact us, like, you want like, hey, here's this much. Or did you contact them?
No. Yeah, the dam will never accept solicitation. Yeah.
I kind of weird. But like, so how does that process work when they like come to you? Like, I have this idea that involves like a metric ton of materials. Like, how does the cost work out in that case?
Didn't you have to negotiate? Like at first they were like, no way, this project is way bigger than what we had in mind.
Yeah. So this room, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this room. It's a room on the sort of topmost floor. It was for a while considered the sort of like local experimental room. I think they now do lots of different things with it. But yeah, so they talked to a lot of, they're like, hey, we'd be really interested in you doing a project. And what people normally do in there is they just sort of show a video, and then maybe they've got something mildly sculptural attached to it. Lolly is crazy. That's why I love her, right? And she was like, well, no, like, I actually want to build this giant thing, and it's going to have like video projection and interactive things. Like, I haven't even told you about all the other features of like this whole thing's interactive. And it's got all sorts of stuff. And And to be honest, initially she actually proposed some way crazier stuff. And it actually was a 3-year conversation because initially they were like, whoa, the kind of vision you have is amazing, but like we wanted something like in 3 months for $10,000. And she was like, right, she was out here. And because, you know, like when you get a show at a dam, you go all in,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, so it was a conversation for 2 years. She went through a lot of ideas with the curator, and she finally settled in this direction. And then we had this sort of like 9-month work period. It took like 6 months to make all the pieces and get all the software working. And then it was actually almost 2 months of like installation. Because like they had to build this giant thing, and then we had to skin it inside and out, and then we had to install the technology.
What's the structure made of?
Like it's a full like, they had to hire union workers. There's steel I-beams and like the whole 9 yards. Yeah. Because any of these kind of internal structures, they actually have to be fire safe, and so it's like those extruded 2x4, you know, like aluminum beams, and then I-beams for the actual substructure.
Did you design the substructure too?
No, that's like, for something like this where they're gonna have 1 million people walk through it, they have in-house engineer connections, and so.
And then did they send you what they were building and then you worked around that
Yeah.
design?
Well, no, we told them what we needed, and then
Okay.
they engineered to spec.
Okay.
And then the builders immediately fucked it up. Because, you know, we were operating on like 1/16 inch tolerances, and he was operating on like 2-inch tolerances. So we actually had to take all of these panels back home and recut them to fit the real cube. Yeah. Sorry, this is going a little bit off track. I'm happy to talk to you more about the project. Suffice it to say, it was really complicated, but like this, I think the big lesson is, you know, like we ended up buying a kit, making a CNC at our house because the cost and amount of time involved in doing this with somebody else was too much. Like it just, like we couldn't have afforded the CNC time, like the cost per hour. Whereas like when we're running the 22-hour pieces, we sleep in shifts so that somebody's always awake while this crazy machine is destroying things in our garage. Because you can't, you know, you don't go to sleep while something like that's running. It's just not, yeah. And it's the reason you are doing 6-inch by 6-inch pieces, which are already going to take way longer than you're really going to want to deal with. All right. So I just wanted to give you sort of like a big scope of where all this can go. I think the last note is, you know, if you just want to look up like CNC and architecture, which I can't spell properly, like the ways especially that architects and designers are using CNC capability has just been amazing. It's been a real explosion over the last 15, 20 years. So you should just surf around a little bit and get inspired because the stuff's really quite nice. Cool? All right. Hopefully you're inspired. Let's take 5 minutes. You're gonna need to get your brain like hyped up because we're gonna jump into Blender and learn some really hard stuff. All right? Take 5 minutes, step away from the computer.
Can you show the interactive? Can you show what was like the digital part of that?
Yeah, I'll just play the video while we're taking a break.
showing for like where she's growing into a tree, which are like pretty branches. I mean, she's basically an apple tree at this point. Like you can pick apples everywhere. Yeah, and then I've also been cutting this stuff off of the, I guess, vegetables or something like that. That's where I've been cutting off. Like I'm trimming the tree in there, getting like clear pieces off.
Also like different seeds.
I've definitely played with those.
You feel like that was
I mean, yeah, it felt more, because sometimes it gets really thin, which I don't mind a little bit of squash in these, so it's like kind of like how starchy would be. But do you think that's like a very ugly looking tree, or is that just good enough for now? Okay, what do you tell the one that doesn't look like you're like, what tree does that look like to you? Like a pecan tree? I don't know what tree it is. I actually felt like maybe it didn't help the spreading out. Also for the printing too, like the time it would take and like all the extra fragments and words in between. I was hoping to make it as nice looking and as dense as possible. And I'm also putting it upside down. So the stem is straight up because I think lower vertical printing will happen that way. So that's like my other strategy. Okay, so I'm not
I think mesh mixer and solidify all this, that'll help.
okay, so
Time.
the solidify, okay, so let me save it, and then I don't think I need the other one solid. Is that maybe why I think that's what happened? Okay, so I'll do the next one and I'll bring it to you before I do the next one. Thank you.
That's not right.
All right. That set the mood.
That noise though. That was a lot.
Yeah, Lale actually worked with a sound designer to do that. And one of the interesting pieces is there's several subwoofers underneath the floor in the room. So when you walk into the room, your body actually starts vibrating. And if you step like just out of the room, you can't hear it at all. It's really interesting. But the audio was like 5 channels, so there were 5 channels of like different things going on. But yeah, Lale goes intense with the audio escapes.
So she went with a sound designer, she did the concert trees.
Oh, I don't think that's an interesting question. She's got a sound designer that she likes to collaborate with, and so I think we just work with him. But I haven't thought about that connection. Cool. All right. So, and for those of you who didn't sort of pick it up, basically there's a series of monitors in almost like gun turret form in the center of the cube. And when you walk in the door, they sense that you're there and they all rush towards you. And they're also constantly going around and around. So it looks like you're kind of looking out the cube and there's just like hundreds of thousands of these little heads that are sort of moving around you. And if you sit still and be quiet in the room, they'll actually gradually disperse and sort of like go back out. So there's a sort of like a tension and conflict built into it. in addition to this stream of strange things coming out of the corner. Anyway, all right. So, Blender. I guess the last thing that I'll bring up is Professor. So I'm just going to bring up the GitHub link. Because again, you might want to grab the current instructions and add to it, or you might want to just sort of semi-follow along. I will say that we've got time. We've got time. So here's how I'm going to do this. And I'm going to ask that you follow these instructions. Which is, I'm going to go through this one time and I want you to watch and take notes only. We can then go through it a second time and you can do it along with me. All right? But I want that to be two separate steps, because if we do the follow along with me first, there's so many jumps that if you're looking at your computer when I do this thing, you're going to get lost. All right? So it's going to be way more useful for you to follow my actions once, and then we'll do it step by step again, where everybody can do it at the same time. Cool? So at this moment, you should take notes. Here's the instructions as they currently exist. Here is the template file. If we get to the end of today and you're like, oh my God, I'll never do that again, we download this and I'll talk a little bit about how you can just use it. But hopefully this will be a great introduction to doing some practical things in Blender. All right, so notes ready, let's do this. Now I'm gonna pull the notes over. Let's see. Stuff out of the way. Open up Blender. Blender's on that screen. Why is it that I want the mirror desktop thing? Doesn't show up. Okay. All right. So let me put this on a second desktop. We will go through this. All right, we're ready. Okay, we start in Blender. Again, I think I have my Blender set fairly to the defaults that you all should see as well, which has a camera, a cube, a light, and a grid that's kind of our floor. Sort of the basic setup. I think the only difference here from what you're probably seeing is that the colors are different. And you can set that in your themes if you would like to. But I felt like this was the most pop for the projected classroom situation. So the very first thing that we need to do is, and this is really something that you want to do with 3D printing or CNC milling, anything where you're trying to make this a physical thing later, is you want to go ahead and set up the units. Because as default, Blender operates in Blender units, which isn't that unusual because 3D software doesn't really care about whether it's inches or millimeters, because you're just making 3D things in a 3D world, and it's kind of irrelevant. But since we're going to make this 3D stuff into the real world, we do need units. So I'm going to go to the Scene tab, which is right here. And these settings are universal across any object that you've selected. And I'm going to go down to Unit Presets and click Inches. Okay? So the Scene tab, Unit Presets, and select Inches. That will just set up the scene to operate comfortably in inches. Yeah?
So for CNC, it's going to be universally computer vision
Again, I'll find out tomorrow whether they set up their shot bot in imperial or millimeters. I might have to tell you to switch this over to millimeters tomorrow. We'll find out. Yeah, we'll find out.
So I see a little different thing on my blender. It says scene and right under it, instead of scene units and all that stuff, it has like render dimensions and anti-units.
You're on this one.
Oh, I thought scene. Okay, wait.
Yeah, it's because we have the scene selected right now. That's why it's saying.
I see.
Scene.
Okay.
Or these are qualities that affect the whole scene.
I won't.
Yeah. So we're going with this little guy here. It looks like two objects and a little light. It's kind of what the icon is supposed to be. All right. So we're seeing is in inches. And I'm just going to follow the. All right. We're going to make sure that we have the cube selected. To select things in Blender, we use the right mouse button. The second mouse, like it's usually your sort of secondary mouse button. This is probably the weirdest thing to get used to in Blender, and there's a reason to it, but it's going to be awkward for a little while. And you can change it, but then it messes other stuff up. So I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, right mouse button selects the object. I'll just show you again. I can click to select the camera, or I can click to select the box. You know what's selected because it's got a colored halo, right? Yours might be orange. I don't know. Right? So select the box. Then I'm going to press the N key, and N is for numeric panel. And what it did was open up this panel. Okay. So press N to open up the N panel. And you can see what's really nice in here is it immediately tells me that the thing I have selected has dimensions. In this case, they're 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. I'm going to go ahead and just type in 6 inches and then hit tab, and 6 inches and hit tab, and I'll leave this other one at 2 inches. And now I've got a simulation of my block of wood, right? 6 by 6 by 2. Cool? All right, so the numeric panel is what gives me a lot of these controls. So the next thing that I want to do is we're going to go in and edit this. And we can do this two ways. There's a button here that switches from object mode to edit mode to sculpt mode to all these other things. So we can select edit mode here, or we can just hit the tab button. And as long as we've got an object selected, it will tab into edit mode. And you know you're in edit mode because I can see the colors for all the vertices and all the edges and all the faces. As a default, when we have a new object, everything's selected at the moment. So I'm going to hit A to deselect everything. So A selects everything and A deselects everything. It's sort of like flipping a switch. So A to deselect everything. Then I'm going to do Control Tab to select faces. And I'm going to right click to select the top face. So Control Tab is just a way to choose what you're selecting. Are you selecting vertices, edges, or faces? So I right click to select the top face. And now, again, I'm just trying to make sure I'm following the instructions. Okay. And so now we're going to go back over here. And it should be noted that this panel changes according to whatever you have selected. At least the last several buttons do. So from here downwards, these things all change according to what you have selected. Whereas like world and scene and render, these are all universal no matter what you have selected. So I'm going to go down to this guy, which looks like 3 vertices in a triangle, which is the object data panel. And I'm going to add a new vertex group. I hate tutorials that never tell you why you're doing the stupid thing that you're doing, so I'm going to go ahead and pre-tell you why we're doing this. The idea here is that eventually we're going to apply a modifier that turns a height map or a displacement map into a topology, right? It's going to extrude it. It's going to physically change it. But we don't want it to apply to the rest of the cube, right? We just want it to apply to the top. We're just cutting and affecting the top. So right now what we're doing is we're going to make a vertex group, a group of vertices, and then later on we're going to say, just do the displacement to our vertex group. Don't do it to everything. So that's what we're doing. Back to the regularly scheduled program. So I'm going to add a vertex group. It's going to be called group. You can give it a different name if you want. Like I'll call this, top side. You don't have to rename it. I'm just telling you. And then what is a really important step? We have this face selected. Right now we've made a group, but that group doesn't have anything in it. So we need to hit the assign button to assign the selected face or faces or vertices to that group. So from now on, that top face or anything that makes up that top face will now be part of the top side vertex group. Cool? All right. So we're done with that step. Now we are going to cut up the object. And this is kind of interesting. So I can like deselect or reselect, whatever. This is kind of an interesting process because there is a button called Subdivide, right? Here in my tools section. And the Subdivide button, what it will do is it will subdivide every face on the object sort of in half. And then it'll do in half again, and in half again, and in half again. And that will actually look great on the top and the bottom. It'll make this into like proportional squares. But on the sides, it means that we're going to have a whole bunch of stuff that we don't need. It's a whole bunch of like extra geometry. And the reason I'm so afraid of extra geometry is that like if I want to make other kinds of changes later, I want as few vertices to deal with as possible, right? Like that's the goal in modeling, is like the least number of vertices because that gives you the most amount of control. So instead of hitting the subdivide a whole bunch of times to chop this up into pieces, noting that the reason we're subdividing, the reason we're chopping it into pieces is that we want to go ahead and make sure the object has enough parts to actually do the deformation. Think of this as like little pieces of wood. So right now, if I give this a picture of a smiley face and I say, deform to become a smiley face, it's a big piece of plywood and it's just going to go bop, right? So I need to cut the piece of plywood into a whole bunch of pieces, and now you can start to see the shape of the smiley face. And the more little pieces there are, the more definition of the smiley face we get. So we're going to pre-cut this big piece of plywood into a whole bunch of pieces. And we're going to do that by what's known as Luton Cut and Slide. Basically, this is a loop cutting tool which will cut all the way around the object in a particular direction, and we can actually make multiples of these. Watch how I do this. This is weird. So I'm going to hit Loop Cut and Slide. And I'm going to come back over here, and you'll see that it's automatically finding different directions of loops. So there's a loop direction that goes around the box this way, around the box this way, and we can probably, if I mess around, I can get it to go around the box that way. That's the one direction we don't want. So I'm going to pick one of the other two directions, say this is what I want, and I'm now going to like stop moving my mouse, and I'm going to roll my scroll wheel. And what you see here is it's telling me how many cuts I'm making. So right now I've rolled my scroll wheel, so I'm making 6 cuts. I want you to make 30 cuts. So I'm going to roll my scroll wheel until this number says 30. Yeah.
So how many more than 30 you're going to have a negative effect? Or is that just not?
We're going to do more later, but like 30 is kind of a good starting space for now. So we're going to do 30 cuts, And then I'm going to press my left mouse button once to accept that number of cuts. And at this moment, I can actually now move all those cuts around, but I don't want to move them. This is why it's called loop cut and slide, right? Like I can like make these loop cuts, and then I can like move them to one end of the box. I actually want them to stay perfectly proportional, so now I'm going to press the left mouse button a second time, and they become fixed. All right? Just to prove, like, so at this point, all these cuts are now made. And now I'm going to do loop cut and slide again, but for the other direction. And just to prove this to you, let's say I'm just making 2 cuts. I press, I use the scroll wheel to make 2. I press once, but you can see I can slide these cuts around. Normally that would be an awesome modeling feature, but we actually don't want it, right? So I'm going to undo, Control-C undo. I'll grab the loop, cut and slide again. Grab the pink rectangle I like. Roll till I get 30. And then hit the mouse button once and twice. And you see the result is we have divided the top and the bottom into a great set of squares, but we haven't subdivided the sides. And what that eventually means is, like, if we need to make our block of wood a little bit thicker below our carving area, or we want to make it a little bit thinner, it'll be super easy to do. But if we had a whole bunch of divisions in here, we'd have to like compress all those divisions, and it becomes like unnecessarily hard. So I've just taught you a trick that's going to save us some time, because we need articulation here, we don't need articulation here. Cool? All right, so that's what here, steps 6 and 7 we just did. And then we're going to sharpen all of these edges. So the next thing I'm going to do is press A to select all of them. And again, they glow. And then I'm going to do Shift E, which is for sharpening the edges. And this has to do with subdivisions that we'll do later. And then I'm going to type the number 1. And what that means is sharpen all of these edges to their fullest extent.
What's their original state?
0. So it'll round them as much as it can.
Okay.
So later on, we're going to be adding subdivisions, which is a way of adding more geometry without doing 100 loop cuts or whatever. But the subdivision plugin will naturally try and round everything off. That's what it does, is it makes everything sort of like cool and organic.
Right.
We actually want this to retain the feel of a block of wood, not a rounded thing. So we sharpened all the edges to tell the computer, hey, I know we're telling you to subdivide, but don't round all of this off. Cool?
Yeah.
All right, so we've sharpened the edges. Now I'm tabbing out because we're kind of done editing the geometry. That's kind of the complex part, right? Is like going in, editing the geometry. But we're pretty much done with that now. So at this point, we're ready to add our first modifier. And our modifiers are done with this wrench here, this little wrench tab. And you'll see that when I hit that, we don't have any modifiers initially. That's sort of a blank state. Modifiers are the way that you can alter an object, but have it be non-destructive. If you all are used to Photoshop and things like that, you're probably used to something like an adjustment layer. These are kind of like 3D adjustment layers. Because it means that I can do a whole bunch of stuff, but I can keep tweaking them. And they stack on top of each other, and it's non-destructive. Cool? So the modifiers are like one of the really powerful modeling features of Blender. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a modifier that is a subdivision surface. We were just talking about this. Add a subdivision surface, and it doesn't do anything. You won't notice a difference. And the reason you don't notice a difference is because we sharpened all the edges. But trust me, we have now subdivided the entire cube 2 more times. So instead of 30, we now have 30 times 30, and then that times that. And the result is that we now have 32,000 vertices and 32,000 faces. Cool? So, adding subdivision, the one thing that I changed is it differentiates between your subdivisions for rendering and your subdivisions for view. We only actually care about subdivisions for view because we're not rendering, right? So view was automatically at 1 when I added the modifier. I turned it up to 2 just to get us a start. We're actually going to turn this up later even higher. But you can see here, if I turn it up to 3, I now have 130,000 faces. If I turn this up to 4, I now have 500,000 faces. That's how much detail I now have available to me. So you have to be careful. I'm going to turn this back down to 2 for the meantime. We'll turn up the detail later. All right, so that is subdivision modifier. Now we're going to finally do the displacement modifier. So add modifier, displace. It's instantly going to start fucking up our model, but that's okay. We're going to fix it. So what do we need to change? We're going to change. So here, this is under the. Sorry, let me stretch this out a little bit. So this is under the displace modifier. I'm going to change the direction to Z because we only want to modify up and down, right? Because our drill bit can only go up and down, so we're only displacing up and down. So changing our direction to Z. I'm going to go ahead and turn up our strength a little bit. I'm just going to turn it up to 10 for now to make it a little bit more extreme. And what else did I tell you to do? Oh, and the Vertex Group. And we need to set our Vertex Group to the Vertex Group that we just made. Mine was called topside. So now it's only affecting topside. You can see that 10 might be too much. I'm going to turn that back down to 1 for now. So right now it's manipulating the top, but using no texture. Did I tell you to do anything else? Oh, and so then the last step is to add that texture. So right now it's just saying like, okay, move everything up by a unit of 1. That's the strength of it, but we don't have any differentiation. We haven't given it our grayscale image yet. To do that, we need a texture object to put this into. Much like every 3D modeling program, they treat the objects and the materials and the textures that help make materials as separate things, right? You don't like make an object and then make a material for it like that is part of the object, and then you make textures that are part of that material. Everybody wants to work nodally because you might want to use that material on several objects, or you might want to use that texture in several materials. So they're all separate things, like sort of file components. So we're going to make a new texture because right now our blend file does not have any textures at all. So I make one, and it's just called texture. Again, if you want, we can rename it. I could call this height map. Doesn't really matter. But I know that now when I manipulate this texture, I'm going to be manipulating our height map. So now I go to the texture tab because this is where we go to manipulate textures. And you can see already that it's automatically selected the height map as being the texture that we might want to alter. It's like, you know, it assumes you just made this texture, you probably want to do something with it. And what do we want to do with it? We want to load an image into it. Now here's where, like, if you were to come to, if you want to get crazy and learn more about like Blender textures and the way that I did our cloud landscapes and things, you would actually do that here, that instead of loading an image or a movie into the texture, we could load a thing called clouds or ocean or Voronoi for you Voronoi heads. You can add some Voronoi. right? So you don't have to load an image from outside. Blender can do some pretty crazy stuff in here. I'm not going to cover that because I'm already throwing plenty at you for right now.
Were those the clouds used?
Do I?
Were those the clouds that you used?
No, I actually use, you go to noise, and noise has about 1 million options. And so in my particular case, I'm using, for each different cloud, I'm using about like 4 different kinds of noise. Because the idea is that you have a noise that's doing really big changes for like big shapes. And then you have noise that's doing like small bubbles in the cloud, and then one that's doing like the really small details. So you have to have scales of noise, and you add them all together. All right, so anyway, we're sticking to image and movie. That's the default anyway. I'm going to hit open because we're going to open the file that we have. And I'm just going to go to my desktop where I know that I've got some of these hanging out, including mountain and tree, and then that like couch bump map, which I'm going to use the couch bump map because why not? Because we're into couches right now. And I'm just going to double click on it. And instantly, the result starts to appear. Right? Not too bad. So there's a couple decisions at this moment. And so just again, what we just did here was instruction number 12. Under image, hit open, and double click on your image. So here's the choice. For an image like this, that's tileable, right? That's repeatable, that this setting might be okay for you if you're planning on having like multiples of this. We'll talk about how to scale those multiples in a second, but let's just say that you want to keep this tileable. You would just move on from here. However, I'm just going to load up a different image here. If I instead go and load up that mountain picture, what did I just do? If I instead go and load up the mountain picture, then my mountain is now sort of like getting repeated weirdly, and not really getting the results I need. And so what I need to do is go to image mapping, and I need to turn this setting of extension, which is like, what do we do when we see the end of the picture? How do I put the picture on this thing? What do I do after the picture ends? And your options are repeat, which is great for tileable. It'll tile your texture for infinity. And you have clip, which is just end it where the picture is. I'll take care of it. Right? It tells the computer, don't you worry about it. I'll take care of it later. Right? And then there's some other options, but really, those are the two that matter. Clip or repeat. Yeah.
So does this sort of like height map thing work on flat surfaces, or can you do it on like a curve?
No, you can do it on any surface.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to hit clip because I want to clip my thing. It's actually fitting remarkably well. This is totally frustrating to me because I've been working at home, and every single time I did this at home, the whole mountainscape was about this big in the middle of my object. Yeah, this is of course, I'll just let it be. So I'll show you in a minute of like this final level of control. But so clip, knowing whether or not you want clip or repeat is a question for you. I'm going to set mine to clip. And again, I talk about that here, whether or not you should use clip. And so we're going to go back and we're going to play a little bit with our value. And so I think that the real question is, when we come back to the modifier, we now can play with strength and say, well, you know what? Like, I want these twice as high. I want it more extreme. And I can also, at this point, adjust my subsurface modifier to get things more or less accurate. So again, if I add even more subdivisions, 500,000 faces, I basically have more faces than I do pixels in the original image. And so I'm getting all the detail that's possible. But conversely, like it might mean that I want this to be a realistic mountainscape, which probably means we want something like 0.2, right? Like this is really how tall mountains are over a 1 mile by 1 mile cube of landscape. So this is where your artistic decision making comes into play. Like how much do you want to experiment with this topology? But again, like if I'm using the couch, so if I'm just going to go back to, you all shouldn't need to do this, but like if I go back in, instead select the couch again, and I'll hit the refresh button. Like the couch may look really good at this definition. When I had it at 1, this obviously didn't really work out, right? So you can see that like 0.2 might actually be fairly realistic for a lot of situations. But it's all up to you. Like this is your artist's choice. So the last step that I want to talk about here, so adjust the strength value. The last thing that I want to talk to you about here is how to move and scale your texture. All right? Because this is this is another one of those like weird steps that makes sense to 3D people. But the idea here is that if you imagine that this is a photograph, and I need to tell the computer where to move this photograph on the surface of my object. Because you can imagine if I'm 3D modeling me, and I have like this awesome patch, racing patch here, like I would want to be able to take a picture and not have it like wrap across the whole body, but I want to be able to scale that and move that over here and situate it exactly where I want, right? Imagine it like a decal. In the same way, even though we're using this as a height map, it's still just like a picture that we're applying to this object. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to make a way for us to control this texture and move it around and scale it. And so in order to do that, we are going to add an empty object. Every 3D program has these. It's just a thing which doesn't render and it doesn't matter, but it's a tool for you to be able to move things around. So I can either come to the Create tab here on the side, and I can add an empty object all the way almost down here at the bottom, or I tell you in the instructions, hold on. All right, that's fine. Or I tell you in the instructions, we can do Shift A, which is Add, for adding objects, and I can scroll down to Empty, just add a plain axes object. Doesn't have to be complicated.
Where's that first one in the Create tab?
All the way down here. So we're adding an empty object because this is going to be the controller for our texture. That's the idea. So one of the things that I tend to like to do is to make sure that my empty is like positioned in a place that makes sense to me. In this case, I would want it at the center of my object, right? So I'm actually going to come down here to Object and Snap Selection to Grid, which is going to put that empty object in the middle of the grid. And then I'm just going to use the blue arrow to move that up. So now that is centered completely on the object. Everybody dig it? Okay. Because I want to do that centering before I assign this empty to the texture. So now, again, following the instructions here, so we've added an empty. We're going to go back to the box, so I'm going to right-click on the box. And under the modifier for displace, I'm going to say texture coordinates. Instead of being local, I want to set these to object. So instead of just like using the texture coordinates that are specific to the object, I'm using the texture coordinates of a different object, and in this case, I'm going to set it to use the empty object. And you can see this has instantly caused a little bit of problem in this particular case because I turned off repeat, right? Like if I wanted my couch texture to be this size for my block of wood, this would be great. And if I go back over to texture and mapping, I can turn clip back to repeat. I now have a smaller couch texture across my entire surface, which could be super handy. But let's say that, well, yeah, so I think that's kind of fine. But let's say actually I want to have not, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across. I instead want to have like 5 across. Well, this is where the empty comes in handy. So I'm going to select the empty, and then I can use S for scale, and I can interactively scale this up and down. Cool? So now scaling the empty scales the texture. And if I move the empty around, moving the empty around moves the texture. Cool? So in this way, I can scale and position any texture I have, whether it's repeating or not repeating, and I can get a lot more control over it. What I will say is that I would encourage you, especially if you're doing non-repeating, sorry, I gotta select the box. If I'm doing non-repeating, if instead I'm doing the clip, and I scale that up, I would encourage you to think about, I'm just going to try and center this again.
How do you center orthographic examples?
Let me show you, because you're going to have to set up your user preferences. Is that I would actually try and leave a little bit of an edge. This is one of those things that I might learn differently on Friday, but I suspect we're going to need a little bit of an edge on the edge, because what happens otherwise is your drill bit will actually try and go around and carve the side of your wood block if you give it this STL file. So to be careful of that, I suspect that we're all going to need to leave like a little, 1/8 inch of an edge, just as a side note. So in general, think about doing something like this, but it's not critical at this moment. We can fix it later if we need to. All right, so at this point, the only other thing that I would point out at this moment is that you should go back now and look at, when we select the box, we should now look at our dimensions, and we can see that at this point we have 2.1 inches in dimensions. So we have a 2-inch block and now we've added stuff onto it. We need to go the other way. This actually ends up being a fairly easy thing to do because we can adjust it here, but we can also go to the displacement modifier and this mid-level setting. And I believe we can just increase the mid-level down to 1, up to 1. And so now the topmost part of the carving is at 2 inches. So now basically our entire image deformation goes downward, whereas as a default, half of it goes down and half of it goes up. The other alternative would be to start with like a 1-inch block of wood and then only go up from there. We'll talk more about those nuances. But this is really it. At this point, I'm going to talk to you about the export process later, but to save this and save it well, as AKA save it with this couch texture so the couch texture doesn't get lost, we want to go to File, External Data, Automatically Pack into Blend, which means it's automatically going to stick those images into the Blender file so that now I can carry around the Blender file and it'll have everything it needs. Right, so I'm going to turn on that checkbox, and then I'm just going to say File, Save, and save this awesome Mega Couch file wherever I like to save Mega Couches.
Where is that? File below export is external data.
Yeah, I'll show you here. Just a second. So it's File, External Data, Automatically Pack into Blend. All right. I have an increasingly urgent phone call. I'll be right back.
See, the last thing I had was I snapped this. I missed the step where you can, I guess, like assign texture to the object.
I think we're going to go over it again. The one that's for like space and then
Putting solar panels on our house right now.
Exciting.
Apparently I had to take a call. It rang 3 times in the market. Okay. How does everybody feel? Like, you feel like you understand the why of the process at least? Like, the whole why is we want to get a texture to displace here. And then all the other pieces are just like add-ins to make that happen. And like, to be honest, I did this about, sorry, what? Yeah, we're gonna walk through it. I did this about 5 times last night and tried like a whole bunch of different processes. Like, you could skip the loop, cut and slide, but it actually introduces other problems later and all sorts of little things. So I hope that you'll trust that this is one of the easiest, most stress-free ways to do this, even though it's still stressful. All right, so are you all ready to do this together? Get your mouse and your blender open.
If you wanted to swap out the image, is there a way to swap it out without having to change anything else, like the scaling, all of that?
I mean, yes and no. Like, if all your images are 1024 by 1024 and you adjust it for one 1024 image, then yeah, you could just keep swapping them until you get something
Everything
like
else you did will stay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So just to Helene's point, let's say that I've got this perfect, but instead of the couch, I want to go back to the mountain or the tree bark, right? It's a good question. All I need to do is go to the texture panel, and here where I have this image, I'm just going to hit the folder to change it to another image.
And it has to be the same size.
Why is it not letting me? Oh, it's because we unpacked. Oh, all right. So, well, if it's not the same size, then it'll end up being weird.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just going to select the tree bark JPEG picture instead, and then I need to hit the refresh button This is the problem. Once I turn on packing, it makes all of this a little bit harder. So don't turn on packing until your very last moment. I'm going to turn this back off. So I'll come back over here, refresh, there we go. So there's a little refresh button here. So there we go, there's our tree bark. I probably want a little bit more detail for our tree bark. And so I probably do still need to come back to the displacement modifier or the subdivision and turn that up or down a little bit. But it should be minor adjustments. Yeah, and this is, I think the bigger point that I'll get to with Helene's question is, if you decide that you don't want to reproduce this whole process, you can download the blend file that I've already provided, and you can just swap in images on it, and it's already got everything set up. Okay? So, but I wanted to offer this learning experience because I'm a Blender head, and so I'm preaching, I suppose, or something. All right. Cool? So I'm going to start over. And this time you're going to do it with me. And I'm basically, what I'm going to be looking for, I don't know how best to do this. I need some way for you to like indicate you finished that step. Right now, like, there might be a lot of like hands up, because I don't want to move on until everybody's like with us. But, so I do expect you to sort of like switch to looking at me or holding up a hand or.
Can we switch to like a gesture that would be less easy?
That's what, I was like, can you like put your computer monitor all the way back?
Or
Or
a thumbs up or something that can't be misunderstood.
I want everybody to like swish their hair. No. I don't, yeah.
That works.
I'm just gonna have to be like, all I'm asking is if any of you are getting behind, this is the moment that we pause and help you, okay? So don't be afraid to be like, whoa, something went really wrong, because I don't want you to get lost later. Okay, so I'm gonna go File, New, and I'm gonna hit Reload Startup File, which is just gonna bring me back to the beginning. To answer Tristan's question in terms of like the viewpoint, really quickly, under User Preferences, there is an option in Interface, maybe, or in System, no, Input. Damn it. Yeah. There's an option in Input where you can click Emulate Number Pad. Because Blender's got this super awesome system where if you have a number pad on your keyboard, then the number pad actually becomes your viewpoint. Whereas this is front, this is top, and this is left, and then this is like camera, and so you can like use your number pad to really switch quickly. But of course, no laptop has a number pad. You can actually get like phone apps that'll sync with your computer, and then your phone becomes a number pad for Blender, if you want to get crazy. Or you can hit this little button, and now 1 goes to front, 7 goes to top, and 3 goes to side. So that's what I use. That's why I was able to switch through that so quickly.
Where is it?
Under Input, you can emulate number pad.
Something I also switched was select the left.
I'm not going to convert, but yes. If you get to the end of the day and like the right mouse button selection is really killing you, this is where you switch it. Select with left or right. It's a bad idea. No. Please do whatever makes you comfortable.
I'm already behind. Where's the input?
You don't have to change this.
Okay.
This is just an optional thing.
Yeah, some of them snap, some of them like rotate one axis.
Yeah, so the way it works is like if you press 7, you go to top, but if you press these two, it's like rotate this way or rotate this way, and rotate this way and rotate this way. So the keypad really is this whole sort of controller. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense in a row. It makes sense in this form.
Doesn't be memorized.
Okay. So, and if you want to save those settings, hit Save User Settings, and that'll save them for next time. Okay? All right. So, here we go. Again, I'm walking through these steps piece by piece, trying to stick to my own plan. So step number 1, we already have a cube. First thing we need to do is change our scene to be into inches. So scene tab, units. It says presets, and we want to set that to inches.
Are we going with this?
Like, I think we're gonna work our hinges out.
Because it says seed at the top, but I can't see.
The scene is the one with the ball, the cylinder, and a little light.
Yeah, there we go.
Cool. All right. I don't hear any clicking, so that might be my key. It's like the clicking has finished. We will move on. All right. So we're now in inches. Our whole world is in inches. So just to follow this properly, we're going to make sure the cube is selected. The cube is probably already selected. It's still glowing. So, but if you wanted to, you could left click onto it to make sure that it's selected. Our cube is selected, and I'm going to press the N button to bring up the number panel. Okay, so the N button reveals the number panel. And in the number panel, we have dimensions for this cube, which is currently 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. And I'm going to set it to 6 inches, so 6 apostrophe, 6 apostrophe. And so now I have a 6 by 6 by 2. Okay. Yeah? Everybody's with me? Cool. I hear some chatter. Do you have questions?
Scale, not dimension.
And you want to know dimensions. Example of this next one. Dimensions is how big it is, scale is how much bigger it is.
Yeah. Yeah, scale has changed from the original. Yes.
That red and white circle, what exactly is that? Because I always move it around, and I'm like, what am I doing when I do that?
So this,
Yeah.
this is known as the 3D cursor.
Okay.
It's an idea in Blender that's from the early methodology. And the idea with a 3D cursor was your ability to place a thing into 3D space, and then you could use that thing to be where you make a new object. So like new objects would appear there, or you can rotate around that place. But that's what it is. It's a 3D
Okay, so
cursor.
it just doesn't matter when it moves around?
Yeah, don't worry about it. Because we can always put it back somewhere else.
Okay.
Great question. Thank you for asking that one. Because that's the most annoying thing is like, what is this thing following me down? Every time I
Other
press.
software, you're like resetting a center, like you're doing things if you use it, so.
Yeah. No, we're not doing anything harmful.
Okay.
Cool? All right. Moving on to the next step. The next step is we're going to grab our top face. So I'm going to hit, I still have the cube selected. I'm going to hit Tab, which puts me into edit mode. And then I'm going to hit A to deselect everything, because right now everything's selected. And then I'm going to switch to faces, or face selection, by doing Control Tab and selecting faces. And you'll know you're on face selection because dots appear in the center of each face. And now I'll go to the center of the top face, and right click to select that face. Okay? All right. So I'm in edit mode, I deselected everything, I switched to face selection, and then I just grab the face I want. At this point, I want to turn that into a vertex group. One of the things you all may have noticed was that at this moment, I can grab one face, make a vertex group, and then when I cut and slide later, it keeps all of those new faces in the same vertex group, which is really handy. Because if instead I like loop, cut, and slid, and cut everything up, I then had to like select all 300 of those faces, that would totally suck. Right? I mean, there's other shortcuts, but there's a reason we're doing it right now. We're making our vertex group right now. So now I'm going to go to Object Data, which is this little triangle here. This is the specific data about the object. I'm going to go to Object Data, and the very first part here, it says Vertex Groups. It's currently empty. I'm going to add a new vertex group, and then I'm going to hit the Assign button to assign the selected face to that vertex group. It will look like nothing happened, right? Because it's just a data thing.
What if I hit it twice?
It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought like hitting the select or deselect, also, you can do that to make sure something happens.
Yes, so I was actually just about to say that, like if you want to double check that you did this properly, I can hit A to deselect everything, and then I can hit the select button, and it will select my vertex group. Now I know that I've gotten a proper vertex group.
Wait, repeat that check one more time.
Like, I can hit deselect and select, and that will select and unselect.
There's actually a button for, oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
So it's a way of checking what's in your vertex group.
Cool.
Okay. I know.
Yeah, sorry. I can't throw extras in. It's your fault.
Sorry. That's a good one. I thought.
It's totally a good one. Okay, so we've made a vertex group, so our modification only affects the top of the cube.
Okay. I don't know how I did this, but I undid like everything instead.
You
and
undid
then, yeah, I'm sorry. I
doubt you've undone it.
I might have. I don't think I have a reason or like. So I just left. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, hit deselect.
So yeah, I need to reassign it.
Okay, so yeah, go back to faces.
So to do that, I control tab. That's the one that's very hard to do. Okay, so faces, and then select the top one with the right button. Then assign the group.
There you go.
Thank you.
All right, we're moving on. So we've done the object data, and we've made a new vertex group. The next thing we do is the loop and cut. Right? It's time to loop and cut. So
Oh, you need a, okay, I see.
I come over here to Tools, and I find Loop, Cut, and Slide. If you don't see Tools, you might have to change from the Create tab to the Tools tab. I don't know. But Tools should be up. I'm going to hit Loop, Cut, and Slide. I'm going to pick one of my 3 directions with a pink rectangle, although I only want ones that go this way or this way. I don't want ones that go this way. So I pick a pink triangle, I hold my mouse there, and I roll my mouse wheel until I get 30 cuts. And it reads 30 right here in the corner. And then I'm going to press the mouse button once and a second time without moving the mouse.
The left?
Yeah, the left mouse button.
Twice?
Press it twice. Do I?
I say I shake just a little bit, so it'll be like.
It'll be alright. And then I'm going to loop, cut, and slide in the other direction as well. Okay? So we got there. Double loop, cut, slide.
Okay, great. Yeah.
I submitted and I have no idea how I got to here.
Okay. Probably the next one. No, it's on the right.
No, we put a little one right.
Okay. Come back over here. Press H. And now over here, you select the one. So now select the group. And now hit select. Okay, so you didn't assign your face to you.
Made eye contact.
So let's go and get group 01. Select faces. Control tab, create faces. And then click that top face. And now hit assign. Cool.
It doesn't
Right, that's the one where.
That's why
Now you want to get your Luton Cut and Slide.
That's the light. Yeah. That's the light.
And the other one's the
Yeah, I used to never have to go past the sleeves.
Anybody else?
Loop and slide.
Do what? Yeah.
So the select loop and slide. And the slide select.
Yeah, you just click it once. There you go. And then hover over this, and you see different.
The one.
That one is like. But the pressure mouse or scroll wheel before you pressure mouse. So undo. And now undo it. So you've got the slide. Hover. Scroll wheel. So this means third quarter. And then press the mouse button twice. So it's like that, that's the left.
Carter's
Now we'll
specifically
be able to go.
this part of the board.
Y'all are doing great.
Yeah.
Hold in there.
Oh, the middle. Right. Oh. Oh my God.
Okay?
Much more pleasing in my colors.
So what?
I said your colors.
Oh.
I'm over here.
In the user preferences, you can choose a new theme. There's lots of them to choose from. Yeah.
Neon orange.
I don't use that one at home either. Like, I've got a really nice one at home. Yeah. Okay.
I don't have enough. How do you get the other direction?
You just need to roll around, please. So you need to hit loop and cut again.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Press A. Okay. A again. Do you think your mouse like clicks multiple times?
It's very possible. Sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. That's why
I'm worried that like it's. I'm just gonna try real quick.
Sure. No, it's okay. You're fine. I just was like crazy and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't showing up.
You're not crazy.
That's a good job. You're just waking up and kissing my person and sleeping beside you with glad to be your
What
life.
did I get?
Well, I just did that.
So here, when I
I'm
hit
reading
loop
a
cut and
story about
slide.
someone who did that in your life.
And then she said,
That's weird.
that's okay, then we put the third.
You got it, Sarah?
I clicked twice, but.
Okay. All right. So again, that's step 7. Repeat to the other direction. And then we're going to sharpen all the edges. Okay? So to sharpen all the edges, I'm going to press A to deselect, a second time to select everything. Right? So now everything is selected. I'm going to do Shift E, which puts me into sharp edging mode or creasing mode.
Wait, so we have to do the loop cut twice? Because it looks like we did it twice, but we only did it once.
Yeah, I told you to do it in both directions.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to hit crease, Shift E, and as a default, you can see here in the corner again, crease is defaults to 0, and you can actually pull this interactively. If you become a Blender modeler later, the idea would be like some places you would have a strong crease, and some places you'd have a weak crease, and that would be between 0 and 1. We instead went to give it the strongest value. I just realized I'm wearing my headphones. Class, which is weird. Sorry. We want to give it the strongest crease possible, so I'm just going to hit the number 1. And you can see crease instantly sets itself to 1, and then I hit return to accept that.
Can you explain what crease is?
Yes, so the best way for me to describe it is, if I could like open up a second Blender window, it would be faster, but the idea here is if I make a box and I add a subdivision modifier to this, what happens is it'll actually turn into a sphere. I know it sounds crazy, but like what Subdivide does is it gives it twice as many faces and rounds everything off. And so the more extreme it goes, the more you get. So crease basically says, take this edge and I want to basically put some tension. I want you to pull the surface back tight against this edge. And so by saying crease L edges, we've basically said, no, you can't deform into a little ball. We're going to like yank you back out from every edge to crease you into the corners. Well, because like modelers as a default when they're using subdivisions want things to get organic and flow. Okay, cool. So everybody's got their crease going on. Shift E and then hit 1 and then hit return. That sets all creases to the full value of 1. I guess I'll do it really quickly here, sorry. If I undo my creases and I come over here and don't do this, just showing you. If I add the subdivision modifier, you see that my box starts to get these weird rounded sides. We're avoiding that. So I'm just going to tab back in, select them all, and Shift E, 1, pop. Now it's sharp again. Cool. All right. So that was step 8. Step 9 is get out of edit mode by hitting the tab button, right? So we're done doing the edit mode. Number 9 is where we're going to add the subdivision modifier, which I've just done. So just to show you what that looks like again, we go to the wrench tab. The wrench tab allows us to add modifiers. We have lots of awesome modifiers, but the one we want is Subdivision Surface. So you're going to add a Subdivision Surface modifier to the cube, and then we're just going to turn the view subdivisions up to 2. So add a modifier, turn view up to 2. So we're just preparing for our awesome texture that we're about to put on here. Cool?
The view is 2.
Yeah. Because remember, render doesn't matter. Because we're not rendering.
Then why don't we just put it to 0?
Well, because 0 would mean no extra subdivisions. But we actually want more. Oh, you mean render?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make, unless we hit the render button, it never even looks at that thing.
Okay.
So, this is one of those classic things of where, like, when you're a 3D modeler and you want your object to have like 5 million faces and it looks awesome, but you can't actually model that way because your computer sucks, then you basically your view modifier is turned up to 2, and then your render modifier is turned up to 5. And then it transforms the geometry to its smoothest ultra result when it renders, but it doesn't do it while you're modeling. That's the reason there's 2 different settings. Cool? All right, so we've done that setting, add subdivision modifier. Now we finally add the displacement modifier. So add modifier, and we're going to hit displace. It's in the deformed section. Add modifier, displace. It's instantly going to mess up our object because it's trying to displace the entire object. I'm going to change the direction to Z, so it only modifies up and down. I'm going to change the vertex group to our vertex group, so it only modifies the top of the cube. And lastly, I'll press new to make a new texture. All right, so direction Z, vertex group, set it to whatever you called your vertex group, and hit the new button to make a new texture. Everybody down with that? So we added the modifier, we changed direction to Z, vertex group to whatever vertex group you made. Just click it and it'll give you a list of all the vertex groups. And finally, there's an area that says texture and it'll say new, and you want to click on it and it'll now say texture. So you basically made a new texture. Yeah.
Can you come over here and look at mine?
Can I what?
Can you come over here? and look
Yep.
at mine? So everything looks fine when
Uh-huh.
it comes to
Yeah.
this, but after display it looks like that.
Right.
But
Don't worry about it.
it looks different, but it's fine. I mean, if you say it's fine, then it's fine. But I don't know what I did wrong.
It looks like okay. Then I think you're fine.
Okay, but like why?
I think you did the add texture before you changed
And I didn't even hit that.
because I did that
But it
Yeah,
doesn't.
before you applied this.
Here's your problem. When you did this Luton cut, you actually moved the mouse.
I did, yes.
And so there's an extra bit of geometry.
But does it matter? Do I have to do it again?
It'll be fine.
Okay, cool.
We'll see if it matters later.
So right now I
Actually, no, you'll fix that later. I'm going to select all.
I changed the direction.
It doesn't matter. Select all. Doubles. Back out with the direction geometry. Okay. You should be fine. Okay, so we now have our displace modifier and we've made a texture sort of thing, but now we need to put an image into the texture, right? So to put an image into the texture, we need to go to the texture tab. Again, here on the right panel, it's the one that looks like a checkerboard. Cool, the checkerboard is your texture panel. It'll look like this. And as a default, it wants an image or a movie for our texture. Note the fact that you could use a movie for your texture. Interesting side things for people. So at that point, what we want to do is you have 2 options for loading an image. One of them is to make a new image, and you can actually like paint an image inside of Blender, because Blender's crazy and does everything. Or we can hit open to open the image that we have made at home in Affinity Photo or whatever.
So it'll just give you like a black and white.
Literally, yes.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to hit open, and I'm going to go find one of my awesome images. In this case, I've got this mountain image, and I can double click on it, or I can click on it and hit open image, whatever you want.
How big was that file, by the way?
It actually says this one is 225 by 225. Super small.
So do you want it super small? Because I tried to load it at 2048 by 2048 and crashed it.
Really? It crashed?
Oh, mine went in, but it was, mine says 20.
What was your file format? That should have been fine. No, I believe you.
This is now with the, like, I followed the first, when this first happened.
Right.
You say
It crashed
2048?
2 times.
Yeah.
Did it have to be multiples of 2 or powers of 2?
Power.
Can it be 200 or does it have to be 2 times 2 times 2 times?
It should be a power of 2 is best.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just grabbing this because it's on my desktop. But
I'll try to shrink it and see what happens.
I mean, you all probably should shoot for a 1024 by 1024. I'm really surprised.
I just did that also and it didn't work, so that's why I was curious. But it seems like it's working for other people.
I'm just going to make one of it perfect.
It's not even square.
I know. Well, technically, it's
Yeah, if it's not square, it'll smash it. It'll
Yeah.
smash it to fit.
yeah.
All right, 2048 by 2048. Don't pay too much attention to my awesome art piece. And then I'm going to blur the whole thing. Blur, Gaussian blur.
That's what I use.
There we go. All right. Wait. Go. Apply. File. Export. PNG. Dithered. Okay, good. My test. All right. I'm gonna do it. But before I do it, I'm gonna save. Progress. All right. So, folder. By the way, those of you who like to look visually, you can hit this little icon button here and see all your pictures and the visual. It's right here, this little icon. All right, so I'm going to select my test. It looks fine. Yeah. So I don't know what happened.
Well, I can't do it.
All right. So yeah, I've got my awesome picture. You know, it might be that I should love to invert this, but no, it's not going to. I'll have to do it somewhere else. So yeah, I've got my awesome picture. I would probably. I think this is actually like a great moment for you to say like, oh, that's kind of not what I was thinking. You know, I can come back over to Affinity Photo. This is a moment that I could go ahead and invert this. I need to like flatten and invert it, I guess. But you know, that's my point. Is like you could work interactively between the two, and then just like if I just come over here and re-export this with the same name, and then just hit the refresh button, it'll actually just refresh the file. Like it's pretty nice. Yeah. I wanted to like quickly invert, but obviously I can't. All right, I don't have time for this. All right, so we have our texture, we have it applied, and again, if we just go back to our instructions, you know, we've opened the texture tab, we've hit open, we've clicked on our image. If you don't want it to repeat, we need to go to image mapping and turn it to clip. Right? So that's image mapping. It might be closed. You might have to turn this down. And we want to set it either to repeat or to clip. That's your call, depending on what it is you're trying to do. Okay? Yes?
Can you come over here, please? I don't know explain that. I'm just wondering, like, why would the edge is different?
Because one of them you're clipping and one of them you're repeating.
But why? Because I don't see it when it's repeating.
Because if you make it smaller, then it will keep repeating. Whereas clip, if we make it smaller, it'll only affect the middle.
Oh. So how does the edge change then? I see what you said. Why would the edge change?
So right now the image is going up to the edge, but not quite.
When
And
it's
so when you
clipping
have-
or when it's repeating?
When it's clipping.
When it's, okay.
And so when you hit repeat, it then fills in.
So
So
it
then-
go over the edge.
Right. It goes past the edges.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right. So again, like in my particular case, I'm going to set this to clip, but you might want repeat. It's up to you. So step 14, we're going to go back to the modifier tab, which is the wrench, and we're going to adjust our strength to meet the demands of our design. Right? Like maybe this is a subtle design, maybe this is an extreme design. I don't know. You're the artist, you've got to figure this out. This would also be the moment that you could play a little bit with adding additional subsurface levels to make it even smoother and more detailed. Right? So if I turn view up to 3, you see that this instantly got more smooth.
How are you able to push and pull it?
Using the strength value here. Under the displacement modifier. Yeah.
Oh, now I see the dot.
Cool.
Cool.
All right. So those are just like those are tweaks that you can do as needed. So the next thing we're going to do is add a controller so that we can modify, scale, and move our texture. Okay, so we're going to make a texture controller object. So this is the moment where we're about to create a new thing. And so we're going to create a new thing called an empty, and it's going to pop up at our random 3D cursor that Helene was asking about. This is a moment that is probably easiest to go ahead and move our 3D cursor to the middle of the grid so that it's in the right place for us. So I'm going to go to Object, Snap, Cursor to Grid. So this basically says move that 3D cursor to my little crosshairs where my X and Y and Z axis come together.
It didn't do it.
It'll do it, and it'll look like it's sort of on top of the object.
It actually picked a different thing along the green axis that's not where all three come together.
It doesn't look like
Is it cursor to grid?
Yeah, I'll try it again. Object, snap. Yeah, it came over here. Where
Cursor to center.
Cursor.
Yeah,
Cursor to center.
cursor to center will work.
Okay. Yeah, I put it right there. That's odd.
And you want it to be above the object, if not in the middle of it?
Yours is actually in the middle of it. Mine is good.
Yeah, I mean, we can move it up later. So just do cursor to center. That's probably easier. Apparently it was snapping to other parts of the grid. So just cursor to center. We'll put it in the right place. And then we can either go to the Create tab here, or we can just do Shift A, and we're going to add an empty. So add empty. And at that point, I can grab the blue arrow and move that empty up until it's above the object.
So empty and what? there are so many options.
Just plain axes is fine.
I think I done something wrong.
What's up?
Because I don't think I did the empty.
Scroll over here. We have an empty.
Yeah, but then why don't I?
Because you didn't pick the one with the axes. I
I
mean, if you want to get rid of it, just press X.
X?
And then make a new one. And then Shift A or create. And scroll down to the yeah, you're just in wireframe. It's this guy here. You can switch back to solid.
So how do I move the axis?
Just grab the blue arrowhead.
Oh, cool.
All right. So we have our empty. Everybody has their empty? All right. So now we need to assign the empty to our displacement texture. So I need to click the cube because this is a modifier on the cube. Otherwise I'm not going to see the modifier. Go to the displace modifier, and under texture coordinates, instead of local, I want to change this to object. Right? Texture coordinates instead of local, I'm going to click on local, and then I'm going to select object. You have to have the box selected to see this. Do what?
Does the empty have to be selected to do this?
No, you have to have the box selected.
Okay, got it. And then what?
And then go to your modifier section and find your displacement modifier.
Okay.
So we're going to hit object, and it's going to open up a new little thing saying, okay, you want to do this with an object, which object? And that's the moment where we tell it, I want you to do this with the empty. Just click and it'll give you a list of all the other objects in the scene. And we want to do it with the empty.
Oh, yeah.
Cool? And it might do something like this.
Yeah.
Right? And that's okay, because now we have total control and we can adjust it to our heart's content.
So one empty only applies to one face. If I want to do something to another face, I have to add another empty.
If you want to do another face, you'd need another vertex group, you'd need another displacement modifier that only applies to that object group, and you'd want another empty. Yeah.
Cool. So can I just drag this like this thing to the other face? Is it possible?
If you made a different vertex group, then you could tell it instead of the group for the top face, I want it for the group for the top side face. Yes, you could do that. All right, everybody's ready? So now is the moment that we can go back, select the empty, and we can use S to scale, or we can use the arrowheads to move it around. If you press S and then just move your mouse, it'll start scaling.
If you liked it the way it was before the empty group, and you like it fitting perfectly on it, do you have to do the empty group?
No, you might be fine. Yeah, I mean, I think the reasons that will be like, so the idea is that the original one, before you add an empty, it's using the local coordinates. And so in theory, if you haven't done anything too drastic, it'll use the coordinates of your original block, or at least your proportions. But if your texture is non-square, and actually your final blocks would maybe non-square, then you might have to do this.
Okay.
And like I was having an issue at home where it was doing it, like I had to add this or else it wasn't big enough. So it doesn't all, local coordinates don't always work, I guess is my lesson. So at any rate, at this point, the only other thing that I would mention is this is where you should pay attention. And if you select your wood block and see that my wood block is now 2.15 inches tall because I've been adding dimension. So the last thing that I would advocate that you do is under your displacement modifier is turn mid-level up to 1 so that the highest point on your displacement is your original wood block.
Are you trying to do different things just to see if it's
Okay.
and none of it will make it.
Looks like it's not. Back to Q and see.
That's, I mean, I'm over I just.
Oh, it's because you're using the MDO1. You've got 2 empty.
Well, it didn't give me an option, it just said it. But I have 2 of these.
Oh, you're producing this one. Let's see here. I have empty and MDO1. So you've been scaling MDO1. Yeah. Now I have to be like the same time.
Because of.
Is it a lens?
So now I'm going to get rid of your action.
Okay.
X.
Right.
Now you grab this one.
And I just do that. Do I use place?
Just hit X. Just drag a little bit.
Okay. Oh, that.
It makes it so you're
My computer. Yeah. Got it. And so now it's back.
she's a leaver now.
My trackpad is like that too. It's okay. And I was gonna have my maybe it's
something.
all around.
I mean, it's probably not all
Oh, sorry, I had other stuff.
No, it's fine. But it shouldn't be that
level. Sometimes it goes below the surface. You can just like
It's true. Yeah, I understand. And I'll know more tomorrow about whether
Okay,
we
yeah.
have that.
Oh, is that?
But I completely agree.
Because
Yes.
whenever I hit S, my computer just freezes.
Just freezes.
Yeah. See? That was good. And I don't.
Oh, it's because you've got your subdivision up so high. Sarah, turn your subdivisions down.
Down to 2.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah, she's got her subdivisions up to 5. I bet you.
I thought that's what how does it like right now?
So that's your computer saying, I really can't handle 5 million pages.
How do I get back?
When I was Anthony, it's already.
Right.
Oh
We're
my
gonna
God.
deal with that next month.
Okay.
Oh, really? That's really weird. Okay, so this is the moment where if you wanted to swap in your images, you have that ability. Like we've got this sort of like finished template. So again, if you wanted to swap your images, all I need to do is go to the texture page, and here under source, it lists what picture you're currently using. I'm going to hit the manila folder to open up my folder and pick a different image. Again, I can use this icon if I want to see the things I'm loading. Because let's say, that's a PSD, that's a bad idea. Let's say I want to load my couch back in. I can double click that and then hit the refresh button to reload it. Okay? So this is where you can really start experimenting. In addition, there would be a second tactic to this, which is actually make additional textures. So right now I have texture, and I could call this couch, right? And then I can hit the plus button to make a second texture and call this one squiggles, right? And into squiggles is where I would load up my other hand-drawn masterpiece. And so now when I go over to my Displace tab, right, my modifier, I can switch between squiggles. Oh, sorry, I need to update squiggles. Update squiggles. I go to my modifier, I can switch between squiggles and couch. Although, again, it's not really updated. Damn it. This is what I get for trying to show you extra stuff. Why is couch? Oh, shoot. Squiggles? Should be squiggles. Couch. Should have the couch image. Damn it. Never mind. These two are linked together and I'm just messing around. Alright. Anyway, you can swap out these images, hit refresh, and try different images, tune different images. I would say that the very last thing that you should be doing, because this is part of your task this weekend, is to have a few of these ready to go. This weekend, I expect you to have some prototypes ready, right? So for Tuesday, I'm basically looking for 3 of these. And what you'll need to do is just basically save different versions. So I'll save a version. And again, don't do this until the very end, but at the very end you can hit pack all into blend. And that'll add your couch file into the blend file. And then I'm just going to hit save. And I'm going to save that as, couch.
Why wouldn't you want to do that until the end?
Because once you start packing image files, it's really a pain in the ass to then swap out image files. Because it's like, whoa, like we've already got an image in here, what are you trying to do?
Even if you were doing that like through the material texture?
Yeah.
Huh, weird.
It sort of grays out the ability to swap it. So I would have a couch blend, and then I would come in here, and you can see, Jeremy, that like now that I've hit pack, this is kind of grayed out, and if I try and change it, like nothing happens.
Interesting.
Because it's packed in, and so what I actually have to do is unpack it.
Okay.
And then I have to hit the folder to grab a new one.
Okay.
So, and then I would have to repack it.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
that's why I'm cautioning. So now I would say, okay, I got my squiggle image. I hit refresh, and now I would hit File, External Data Pack, and File, Save, and I would save a new version. I actually save as, and then instead of couch, I would have squiggle, blend, whatever. So you should come to class with 3 Blender files. Cool? And those 3 Blender files should have the image packed into them so that you don't lose it between here and there. My last note is that basically on, so half of you are going to learn all about CNCing tomorrow, 10 a.m. Do not miss it. Reinforced. I'll see a lot of you at 10 a.m. tomorrow in the engineering building on the bottom floor, and we'll learn how to use the shop bot. The other piece of all of this is basically on Tuesday I'll talk to you about applying your modifiers, flattening the object, exporting an STL or whatever file format we need, which I'll find out tomorrow. We'll find out what file format we need tomorrow, and I'll give you all those instructions so that then you'll be able to walk into the engineering building with your file ready, but you'll still have to plug it through the slicing software. And I guess I'll just say really quickly, because we have a moment, we are going to be using Vertex Cut 3D. This is not free and open source. This is not my choice. This is what they use in engineering, and so we have to conform. This software is fairly expensive. I mean, you know, everything's relative, but it's a few $100s. So I'm certainly not expecting you all to buy it. But what it means is that you need to plan into your time planning to go over there, put this into their software, and then export your G code essentially. Okay. If this even opens, Vertex is a really high quality company. You're going to find that the other part of this is they only make Windows products, and they only update them like every decade. Well, all the CNC stuff has some of the worst interfaces in the universe. It's really terrible. Yeah. Yeah.
Question, is there going to be, when we need to use it over there, with the different processes, is there going to be like a sign-up sheet to be able to use it for our project?
I'm going to find out tomorrow. Because I'll tell you all what I've been telling everybody else. The number one thing is, nobody else is really using the ShopBot. Everybody else over there is excited to use the giant 4x8 CNC machine. So the ShopBot is pretty much ours. If they don't have a sign-up process, then we are going to put one into place.
That was my question, because
Yeah.
everything else over there, they don't.
Right.
So I just wanted to ask.
No.
Is it also open 24/7?
No, it's not.
No.
They close by 10.
Yeah. So yeah, like it's the reason that like we're really moving a little bit quicker on this project, because it's going to take us a solid week and a half to get everybody through there. Yeah.
Is there any other alternative resources available for worst case scenario?
For CNCing?
Yeah.
No, it works.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't like talked to anybody else about using their machines.
I'll call and find out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Other than the strength in that one bumper, how else did you make it smooth? I thought there was another thing that smoothed out.
I mean, some of the smoothness comes from whether or not your image can be blurry or not. So you can do some of that in your image editing. But the other one is under your modifiers, adding additional subsurface numbers.
Okay.
But just note, if you go up to 4 or 5, you're taxing your computer.
Yeah. Mine was at 6.
Wow, no wonder. Listen, your computer's fine. All right, guys. Good luck. And again, all of this is on GitHub for you to check out. And if you want to watch some tutorial videos of Cut 3D, that would probably also be like a smart thing to do. Little extra level up.
For which